Why the village couldn't sleep. The village of the stars. On the western coast of an island where the cliffs looked like ancient walls raised by sleeping giants, there stood a village of dark roofs, low chimneys, and doors painted navy blue. In the mornings, the air smelled of burning peat, wet salt, and oat bread just pulled from the oven. In the afternoons, when the tide seemed to breathe slowly and the gulls traced white circles over the harbour, the wind came down from the hills and tangled itself through the narrow lanes like something ancient, restless, and ever-changing. That place was called Dunrealta, the Fort of the Stars. The elders said that long before there were houses and fishing nets hung out to dry, a queen from the hills had come down one night to look at the sea. She left behind a silver brooch shaped like a spiral in the grass. Ever since, the wind had never blown there the way it did anywhere else. It listened, it hesitated, it lingered at certain doorways, and sometimes when night was falling, it seemed to whisper names that no one fully remembered upon waking. In Dunrealta lived a young harpist named Eowyn. He was not yet considered a full-grown man in the eyes of the village, though his hands were already long and steady, the hands of someone who had spent many hours bent over taut strings. His dark hair always looked a little tousled by salt air, and in his grey eyes there was a quiet attentiveness, the kind found in people who hear things others let slip past them. He spoke little, he smiled easily, and when he sat beside the window in the house where he lived with his Aunt Muiren, people crossing the street would unconsciously slow their steps when they heard the notes of his harp. The harp had belonged to his family for generations. It was small by the standards of grand halls, but beautiful. Its pillar was carved with interwoven knots. At the peg box there was a crescent moon. The wood, polished by old hands, held a warm colour like honey darkened by time. Muiren said it had been made from yew and rowan, trees that remember and protect. Eowyn did not know whether that was true, but when he tuned it at dawn, he felt as though the instrument was waking too, as if it breathed. And yet, ever since the last autumn, something strange had settled over Dunrealta. It was not a visible misfortune. There was no widespread sickness, no failed fishing, no sign of a lasting storm. The nets still came back full often enough. The sheep still grazed on the slopes. The mill still turned with its patient groan. And still a kind of unease had settled over the village, fine as dust, as persistent as the damp that clings to stone. People forgot simple things. They left a cup in a cold oven. They went to the well and came back without water. They woke in the middle of the night with thoughts rushing past each other, shapeless, as if many voices were all speaking at once behind a closed door. The children had grown more irritable. The old sat staring at the fire for too long. Fishermen argued over trifles. Seamstresses lost their thread. The blacksmith struck the anvil too hard. And the baker, who used to sing while she kneaded, had stopped because she said there was already too much noise inside her. "It's the wind," some would mutter. "It's the hills," others would say, lowering their voices. "It's the changing season. It's tiredness. No one sleeps properly anymore." And all of that was true, perhaps, but it did not explain why, on nights of thin moonlight, the air around the village seemed to tremble faintly, like the rim of a crystal glass just before it rings. Eowyn began to notice it in his own music. When he tried to play the old airs his mother had taught him before she died, some notes came undone. Not out of tune, exactly. More like drifting sideways, as though caught by an unexpected current. A simple melody that had always once found its own way now faltered halfway through a phrase. Another would tighten too much and leave behind in the room the strange feeling of having remembered something important and lost it in the very same instant. One rainy afternoon, while the hens took shelter beneath an overturned cart and the windows trembled under a long gust from the west, Muireann watched him from the table where she was cleaning wild parsley. "You feel it too?" She didn't ask. She said it the way one confirms the color of the sky. Eowyn let the last string hum until it faded. "Yes. And what is it you feel?" He took his time answering. Outside, water ran through the ruts in the path with a soft sound, almost kindly, as if the wind is trying to say something, but saying it too fast. Muireann nodded. Her hands, strong and unhurried, kept separating the good leaves from the stems. "Your grandfather used to say the air can become tangled too, just like wool, just like thought." Eowyn smiled faintly. "You never told me that part. You never asked." That was very like Muireann. She kept stories the way others kept seeds. Not out of hardness, but by instinct, she offered them when the season was right. "And how do you untangle the air?" he asked. Muireann looked up. In her eyes was the same pale grey as the winter sea. With patience, sometimes with silence, sometimes with a song that has almost been forgotten. The first stirring, the rain fell until night, then the sky opened, the village lay washed clean, dark and shining beneath a half moon. Eowyn stepped outside with his harp wrapped in wool and walked to the edge of the cliff where clumps of heather and low grasses gleamed silver with dew. He liked to play there when he needed to hear more clearly. The sea below moved with deep calm. The waves did not break violently, but with a rounded, ancient cadence, like an enormous animal sleeping. He sat on a flat stone. He waited. The wind came in short bursts at first, uncertain. Then it held itself over the grass and the cliff's edge. It carried the smell of seaweed, wet earth, and late flowers hidden in the hollows. Eowyn rested the harp against his shoulder and played a simple scale, then another. The strings answered with a soft brightness. And then something happened that he had never felt before. Instead of scattering, the air around him seemed to gather. Not violently, not like a whirlwind. More as if several small currents coming from different places had recognized a center. Eowyn's hair moved backward. The sleeve of his coat brushed his wrist with a cold caress. And a low note, barely plucked, lingered a moment longer than it should have. Eowyn played the phrase again. The wind grew still. Not entirely, the sea still breathed. The night was still alive. But something in a small radius around him came into order. It was a clear and delicate sensation, like smoothing a wrinkled blanket over a bed, like when a disordered room suddenly has space again for light. He played another succession of notes. A gull that had been crying in the dark went silent, not from fear. It simply settled on a lower rock and folded its wings. The heather stopped trembling so nervously. Inside his own head, Eowyn felt a strange rest. The thoughts that had followed him every night. The grain count, the sail that needed mending, the condition of the hooks, the old grief for his mother, the formless worry that lately seemed to belong to everyone, settled like mud sinking to the bottom of a bowl. They did not disappear. They simply stopped crashing into one another. The young man slowly lowered his hands. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, rounded, welcoming, a silence in which it was easier to breathe. "So it was you," said a voice behind him. Eowyn turned, startled, though not afraid. A few steps away, wrapped in a grey hooded cloak, stood Brid, the herb gatherer. She was a woman whose age was impossible to measure. Her cheeks were lined with wrinkles fine as roots, and her dark eyes always seemed to know where to look, even in shadow. She carried a basket with meadowsweet yarrow leaves and little flowers that opened only at night. "I didn't hear you come," said Eowyn. "That's because you were listening to something else." Brid stepped closer and stood beside the stone, looking out at the sea. "My mother used to speak of music like this," she said. "Very rarely someone is born who can give the wind a gentler road." Eowyn swallowed. I don't know what I did. Good, if you understood it too soon, you'd ruin it with eagerness. That drew a brief laugh from him, soft as breath. Brid tilted her head toward the harp. Play again. Eowyn obeyed. He searched for the same sequence, though he was not sure he remembered it exactly. The first notes were hesitant. Then almost by themselves, they found their place. It was not a full melody yet, more like a gesture. A door left ajar, a small pattern into which the air fit with relief. Brid closed her eyes. Her breathing, which had been short from climbing the path, slowed. The wind lifted the edge of her cloak, then let it fall gently. Yes, she murmured after a while. The ordering song. You know it. I know its shadow. Many years ago, I heard it named in a stone house in the north, where women carded wool by the fire and knew more than they ever said. They called it an fan, a Quirion swan, or an air, the melody that lulls the air to sleep. Not a spell sleep, not forgetfulness. Good sleep, rest, stillness. Eowyn lowered his hands again. His heart was beating fast, though not from fear. It was the clean excitement of standing at the edge of something immense and kind. And why was it lost? Brid opened her eyes and looked toward the inland hills, which under the moon looked like the backs of ancient animals lying around the village. Because there came a time when people stopped listening to the wind and listened only to their own haste, and melodies like that cannot bear to be chased. They hide. The waves broke below in a pale, luminous foam. In the village, very far and very near all at once, a dog barked, and then everything returned to calm. Brid laid a light hand on Eowyn's shoulder. Tomorrow before dawn, go to the hazel well, the one beyond the heather path. Sit there with your harp, don't play right away. Wait until the land wind meets the sea wind. That's when the air remembers its shape best. And then listen, and play only what asks no effort of you. Eowyn looked at the strings where the moonlight left silver lines. Will that be enough to help the village? Brid smiled, and in that smile there was old weariness and tenderness. The deepest things rarely begin by making noise. They walked down the path together. With every step, the sleeping village seemed less tense. Not healed, not yet. But around Eowyn, for a few yards, the air held a delicate stillness, as if the night had been combed by patient fingers. At the first house, Brid said goodbye without ceremony and turned down a side street. Eowyn continued alone to his door. Before going inside, he raised his eyes. Over the rooftops of Dunre Alta, the wind ran in pale ribbons visible only to someone who knew how to see. And among those ribbons, for one brief instant, he thought he made out a shape. Not a body, not exactly. More like the luminous curve of a woman turning in the height, made of mist and moon, her hair mingled with fine clouds. She inspired no fear, only a profound reverence, ancient as the tide. He blinked. The vision was gone. The well of hazels. Eowyn entered the house without lighting any more lamps. Muireann was already asleep. The fire had sunk to low red embers. He left the harp beside the window and lay down fully dressed on the wool blanket, thinking of the hazel well, of the half-remembered song, of the rest he had felt settling inside his mind like slow snow. That night he dreamed of a valley covered in bluish grass, and in the middle of it, a white tree whose fruits made sound as they moved. Not like fruit, but like little strings plucked by invisible fingers. Beneath that tree, someone was tuning the dawn, and when he woke, long before the first light, he knew the wind was waiting for him. He rose without a sound, with that strange clarity that sometimes follows dreams which leave one thread caught in the day. The house still lay in the blue dimness before dawn. Only a few low embers remained in the hearth, pulsing faintly under ash. Muireann slept behind the linen curtain that separated her corner from the rest of the room. Eowyn put on his wool coat, slung the harp over his back, and stepped out into the cold. The village rested in silence. It was not perfect silence. It never was by the sea. There was the creak of wood on the pier, the sigh of a drawn rope on some boat, the distant wash of undertow working through the stones. But over all of it rested the stillest hour of the night, when even dogs seemed to dream more slowly. He took the heather path. The earth was damp. Dew clung to the hem of his cloak and to his boots. On either side of the way, the dark shrubs gave off their clean scent, slightly sweet and slightly sharp, mingling with the salt. Higher up, between the gentle mounds, twisted hawthorns and a few young rowans leaned under the wind of many years. The sky was only just beginning to lighten in the east with the pearly grey that was not yet morning. Only promise. The hazel well lay in a rounded hollow, sheltered by tall grass and 3 old broad-crowned trees. In autumn their branches produced abundant nuts, and the village children came there with small baskets and fingers stained with earth. But in that season only glossy damp leaves remained, and the ground was speckled with empty shells from the year before. The stone rim was covered in moss. Ferns and tiny white flowers that had not yet opened grew around it. Eowyn arrived while the air was still almost motionless. He did not sit at once. He remembered Brid's words. Wait. So he set the harp carefully on the dry grass and stood still, listening. From there he could not see the sea, but he could feel it at the back of the landscape, like some great animal stretched out beyond the hills. The land wind smelled of wet leaves, cold bark, and roots. The sea wind farther off carried a trace of salt and foam. For a time they only arrived in turns, brushing the clearing without yet mingling. Eowyn drew a deep breath. In that stillness, small things began to surface. Things the unease of recent months had covered over. The pecking of a robin among the ferns, the thin dripping of a branch onto the wellstone, the almost inaudible crack of a dry hazelnut shell splitting beneath the weight of dew. These sounds demanded nothing. They were simply there. And by being there, they too put time in order. At last he sat. He still did not take up the harp. He rested his hands on his knees, closed his eyes. Then he felt it. First, a shift in temperature, then a simultaneous touch on both cheeks as though 2 invisible hands had approached from different directions. The land wind descended the slope. The sea wind rose through the hollow. They met in the center. They did not collide. They braided themselves together. Eowyn opened his eyes and took up the harp. The strings, when he touched them with his fingertips, seemed more sensitive than usual. He sounded a low note, waited, then another slightly higher, then a third that he did not seek with his mind, but with the gentle attentiveness that sometimes guides better than the wish to get things right. The air answered with a faint vibration. The hazel leaves turned over, showing their pale undersides. The moss on the well seemed to darken for a moment, soaked in a deeper stillness. He continued. The notes did not present themselves like a learned melody, but like stepping stones in a ford slowly revealing themselves beneath water. One here, another a little farther on. If he tried to hurry ahead, he lost his footing. If he lingered too long, the flow broke apart. So he let himself be carried by a patience that was not entirely his own. The phrases emerged, short, breathing, open. Between one and the next, there was enough space for the wind to rest within them. Then the well gave back a sound. It was not an echo. It was a soft, crystalline note, as if the water beneath the stone had held the memory of that music and was offering it back to him, cleaner, older. Eowyn did not lift his hands. He kept playing, his heart beating very slowly now. Each answer from the well revealed a new curve in the melody, a pause, an unexpected descent, a string that had to be brushed, not plucked. The light grew. The sky above the trees turned the color of blue milk. Then a thin blush of pink slid between the branches. And in that moment, when the first brightness touched the rim of the well, the air in the hollow grew so serene that Éowyn felt a deep, almost childlike emotion, a mixture of relief and gratitude. It was as if the world had exhaled after holding its breath for months. A voice spoke to his right. "That's how it is done." Éowyn turned his head without stopping his hands. Sitting on a low stone, where an instant earlier no one had been, was a woman wrapped in a green-grey mantle. She seemed neither young nor old. Her long pale hair was the color of mist when early sunlight passes through it. Her eyes were light, but not of one fixed shade. At times they seemed river-colored, at times like a rain-heavy sky. In her hands she held a hazel branch heavy with fresh leaves, though the season did not justify them. Éowyn felt respect, yes, but no fear. The village knew enough stories to understand that in certain hours and certain places, the visible world sharpened its edges and let ancient presences through. The Aossi, some said. The people of the hills, said others. It was better not to name them too often. Better to incline the head a little and keep the voice clean. The woman smiled faintly. "Don't break the thread," she said gently. "Speak only when the phrase has closed." Éowyn obeyed. He finished the turn of notes. Let the last sound sink into the well and come back as brightness. Then he lowered his hands. "Was it you I saw above the village last night?" She tipped her head, as if amused by the question. "Sometimes I am seen with a form and sometimes without one. That depends more on the eye than on me." Her voice was very soft, not whispering, simply exact. It had the timbre of water over smooth stone. "Does the melody come from you?" "No, it comes from farther away than I do, but I have kept it at times, as others have kept it, as wells keep it, and trees that have listened for a long while, and certain houses where people still sweep slowly at dusk." Éowyn looked at the moss-covered rim. Brid called it the ordering song. "That is a good name. It is not the only one." The woman lifted the hazel branch and traced a small arc in the air. Every village has an inward sound. Every family, every mind as well. When those sounds pile upon one another without being heard, the air fills with tiny edges. No one sees them, but everyone feels them. Pots boil over faster. Words stumble. Sleep grows fragile. People think their weariness comes only from within. But that is not always so. Éowyn thought of the baker, the blacksmith, the irritable children, the strained silences of recent weeks. Why did it happen here? The woman ran her fingers over a hazel leaf. Because Dunrealta listens too much. Places open to sea and hills gather more than rain and wind. They gather moods. They gather the remnants of what has gone unsaid. And this winter many hearts were troubled at once. One worry calls to another. After that, the air does what it can with so many loose threads. The explanation did not resolve everything, and yet it fit with a strange naturalness, as though some old part of Éowyn had already known it. Then this melody can help. Yes, if you do not try to master it. She looked at him with serene seriousness. It is not for commanding. It is not for forcing calm the way one slaps a lid onto a boiling pot. It is for reminding the air of its gentler course. And when the air grows still, thoughts find room. That is all, and that is much. Éowyn lowered his gaze to the strings. I'm afraid of doing it wrong. That is good too. A small, clean fear makes the hands careful. A light breeze moved through the clearing. A few leaves fell soundlessly at the edge of the well. Will I see you again? He asked. The woman did not answer at once. She looked toward the unseen village behind the rise. You will see me where the music touches something that still knows how to wait. Then, as if the moment had reached its proper shape, she added, "There will be market in the small square tonight. Play there, but not for everyone at once. Begin for the air. The others will hear afterward." Eowyn wanted to thank her, but when he glanced down at the harp and then looked back up, the stone was empty. Only a green hazelnut remained on it, freshly fallen, still cupped in its soft husk. He picked it up carefully. It was cold, real, and it gave off a clean, milky, almost sweet scent. The sun finally broke over the slope, the clearing filled with soft light. The well kept silence. Eowyn played once more, only once, to set the shape of the melody in his body. It was not complete yet. He could still feel the hollows in it, openings through which an untamed current still moved, but now it had a pulse, a center, the small market square. When he returned to Dún Réalta, the village was waking. Shutters were opening. A woman shook out a blanket in a doorway. 2 children ran after a hen with their usual disordered delight. And yet Eowyn sensed something different. Perhaps it was only that he himself had grown quieter inside, or perhaps the hollow had left around him a faint wake. Because when he passed the blacksmith's workshop, the man lifted his head, drew a deeper breath, and let the hammer fall with less force. The baker, seeing him cross with the harp, rested her hands on the dough for a moment and closed her eyes as if recalling the name of a song she had heard in childhood. Muireann was waiting at the door, wrapped in a brown shawl. She did not seem surprised. "You found a part of it," she said. Eowyn took the hazelnut from his pocket and set it in her palm. Muireann looked at it without touching it. "Yes," she murmured. "I can see that." They went inside. The room smelled of cooked oats. While she served breakfast, Eowyn told her everything that had happened. He embellished nothing. There was no need. Muireann listened in silence with the full attention of someone who knows some stories must not be interrupted. At the end, she laid down her spoon and looked at him with grave tenderness. "Your grandfather used to say some kinds of music are not learned only by the ear. They are learned by conduct. There will be days when a note refuses you because you have spoken too quickly, or because you have carried too much haste in your chest from morning till night." Eowyn smiled. "That makes things rather complicated. It makes them truer." They ate slowly. Outside, the village was already filling with footsteps, voices, and the friendly squeak of small carts entering along the main street for the afternoon market. Eowyn felt the anticipation like a new current, but he did not let it pull him away. He remembered the words of the woman in the clearing. "Begin for the air." When he finished his bowl, he rested a hand on the body of the harp. The wood still held the chill of dawn. And throughout the rest of the day, while Dún Réalta unknowingly prepared itself to hear something ancient and benevolent, he held the newborn melody inside him the way one holds an ember, without clutching it, without showing it off, sheltering it from the harsher wind so that when the time came, it might offer its warmth to everyone. The afternoon descended over Dún Réalta with a pleasant slowness, like a blanket someone spreads carefully over a village's shoulders. Since midday, the small square had slowly filled with simple stalls, baskets of late apples, braids of onions, jars of dark honey, cloth dyed with heather and lichen, oatcakes wrapped in linen, small knives with bone handles, ashwood combs, and bunches of herbs tied with red thread. The market was not large, but it had that quality known places sometimes hold, where every object seems to carry a story with it, and every face a season. Eowyn spent the first hours helping Muireann move a low table beside the house door. She sold ointments, sachets of sea lavender, infusions for sleep and aching bones, and little charms woven from wool thread and dried seeds. As they arranged the jars, he felt the murmur of the village like a shifting current. There was laughter here and there, yes. Also the clink of coins, greetings between neighbours, the mild haggling over the price of butter. But underneath it all, that unsettled vibration still flowed, fainter than in previous weeks and yet present, as if many minds, even in the middle of ordinary life, still held a humming beneath the forehead. He could see it in people's gestures. A woman forgot why she had opened her purse. A boy stopped in the middle of a sentence and frowned, searching for a word the way one searches for a sheep outside the pen. Two brothers quarreled over a bucket of milk, and just when one was about to laugh, his face hardened for no reason he understood. Nothing was grave, everything was tired. By mid-afternoon, fishermen from a neighbouring cove arrived with salt-stiff cloaks. Later, an old saddler appeared with his crooked cart and half a song under his breath. The sky, pale in the morning, slowly took on a luminous grey. It did not threaten rain. It was the colour of dimmed pearls, undyed wool, pale smoke rising straight upward. "You'll play at dusk," said Murin without looking at him while arranging a few sachets of chamomile. "Yes." "Good." She said nothing more. She never crowded with advice the space where someone had to find his own footing. And that restraint, more than any lack, was always a form of trust. Eowyn carried the harp to the small square when the oil lamps had begun to be lit one by one beside the doors. A stone bench stood beside the old ash tree near the communal well. He had played there many times, at feasts or during slow summer evenings, but that time he did not go straight to the bench. He remembered the instruction, not for everyone at once, first for the air. So he left the square behind and took the lane that sloped down toward the open edge of the village, where the last houses gave way to a patch of short grass facing the sea. There the wind arrived with fewer obstacles. On one side stood a stone wall covered in yellow lichens. On the other, clumps of sea fennel trembled with a fresh fragrance. Eowyn rested the harp against the wall and stood still. From far off he could hear the market. The voices rose and fell, blurred. Closer by, the air carried the murmur of the sea, the wings of a crow, the whisper of grass against grass. He closed his eyes for a moment. He did not seek the whole melody, only its center, the feeling he had known at the hazel well when the world seemed to smooth itself from within. He sat on a flat stone. The first note came out small, almost private. The wind brushed it without stealing it. Then came another and a third, spaced like footsteps over damp ground. Eowyn did not watch his hands. He let them fall where the body remembered better than the mind. The notes joined one another without hurry. There was room between them for the breathing of the place. The effect was not immediate. Or perhaps it was, but in such a subtle way that it would have been easy to doubt it. A gust that had been coming unevenly became steady. The edge of his coat stopped fluttering nervously and began to move in a longer cadence. The crow, which had cawed twice harshly, fell silent. And inside Eowyn, just behind the eyes, that gentle clarity opened again, the one he was beginning to recognize. He kept playing. The melody stretched a little farther than it had at dawn, not because he forced it, but because the air itself seemed to offer continuity. There was a descent that led into two low notes, almost earthen, then a very fine rise, like steam lifting from wet stone, then a pause. In that pause lay much of its power. It was not an empty gap. It was a space where thought suddenly stopped pushing itself. When he felt that the air before him had accepted the shape, he stood slowly and returned to the square with the harp in his arms. No one in particular was waiting for him, though several people raised their heads when they saw him approach. The old ash spread its dark branches above the well. The lit lamps cast amber light over the faces. A group of children played around an empty barrel. Brid the herb gatherer stood beside a stall of carded wool, as if she had simply come out to buy thread. But her eyes met Eowyn's for a moment, and in them there was the faintest nod. He sat on the stone bench. He announced nothing, asked for no silence. That would have broken the delicacy of the moment. He simply rested the harp against his shoulder and let the first phrase fall over the square the way clear water is poured into a bowl. The conversations did not stop at once. A merchant went on arguing about measures of barley. A woman called to her daughter. A man coughed. But little by little the music began to weave itself among those sounds and surround them without cancelling them. The melody asked for no attention. It pulled at no one. It merely offered a wider shape in which everything might settle. Eowyn followed it. He noticed at once that playing at the center of the village was different from playing at the well or before the sea. Here the air was loaded with human traces. Hurry, words, small worries, memories of long days. The melody had to pass through all of that without hardening. So he made it simpler still, less bright, warmer. One of the little girls stopped running. The old saddler rested a hand on his cart and looked at the ground, as though something tired inside him had at last been allowed to sit down. The baker gave a brief, startled laugh, realizing that she had been breathing for several seconds without the usual weight in her chest. Two brothers on the verge of fighting over a jug looked at each other and, without knowing why, decided to share it. Near the well, an old woman who often forgot names and errands lifted her face, and her features softened with the expression of someone recognizing the smell of an old home. Then something deeper happened. Not visible to everyone, perhaps, but palpable. The wind that until then had always rushed through the square in abrupt bursts began to circle it in a broad, rounded current. The flames of the lamps no longer tilted so sharply. The ash tree made all its leaves sound with one voice, not with 1,000 nervous little rustlings. And the thoughts of the village, if only for a moment, seemed to find shores. Eowyn felt the magnitude of that, and with it a sharp flicker of fear. Not fear of something dark, but of the weight of caring for something fragile. For 1 second his mind tried to rush ahead. Don't fail, hold it, finish well. And in that same second a string answered harshly. The melody faltered. Only the smallest stumble. Hardly anyone would have noticed, but he did. He felt the air tighten slightly, like a sensitive horse under an ill-judged pull on the reins. Then he heard Muirin's voice among the people, calm as a sheltered flame. "Breathe, boy." She did not say it loudly. There was no need. The words reached him with the exactness of things spoken at the right moment. Eowyn let go of the effort. He allowed the next note to emerge lower, simpler, without adorning it. Then another, and the melody found its course again, not like a victory, but like water returning to its channel. The air in the square settled. Several people exhaled at once without realizing it. Even a dog lying beside a fish stall rested its muzzle on its paws with a long sigh. The music continued as evening turned to night. The first stars appeared between torn scraps of cloud. Some villagers gradually sat where they could, on steps, on empty crates, by the well at the foot of the ash. No one had decided to gather, and yet there they were, together. Not motionless, not enchanted, but quieted in that rare and precious way when company stops being noise and becomes shelter. Brid closed her eyes. The baker began to hum very softly underneath without disturbing the melody. A child rested his head in his mother's lap and fell asleep with the natural ease of creatures when the world regains a kinder measure. Even the newly arrived fishermen, men with hard shoulders and weathered hands, seemed for a moment less burdened by what they never said. When Eowyn let the final note fall, no one applauded. That seemed beautiful to him. Instead, there was a full, warm silence. A home-like silence. Then little by little voices returned. But they returned differently. Lower, clearer. As if each had found enough room not to collide with the others. The baker was the first to speak. "I don't know what you played," she said, smiling with tired brightness. but for the first time in many moons I feel my head like a room with the window open." Soft laughter answered her. The blacksmith rubbed his beard. "I'd have said I was only in a foul mood from work. Now I'm not so sure." Breed came over to the bench, her basket on her arm. "Don't play too much tonight," she said quietly for Eowyn alone. "The melody needs to learn the village too." He nodded. His hands were warm, almost numb, and there was another feeling in him as well, something new. The sense that he had opened a door one should not run through. The people began to drift away slowly, not with the broken dispersal of other days, but with an almost festive gentleness. Some lingered a little longer beneath the ash, reluctant to break the calm enchantment of the air. The lamps kept burning. From a nearby house came the smell of barley soup. Farther off, the sea repeated its ancient breathing against the rocks. Eowyn put away the harp and, lifting his gaze, saw for one instant above the square, just where the ash branches touched the night, a line of tiny pale lights. They were not stars, they looked like seeds of moonlight suspended among the leaves. They lasted no longer than a blink, but it was enough for him to understand that the village had been heard. And as he walked home beside Muireann, under the first truly peaceful night in a very long time, he knew that melody had not come only to soothe a passing unrest. It had come to remind them of something older, something Dunrealta had once known and now needed to learn again patiently. That the air also shelters, that silence can be a form of warmth, and that some kinds of music are born not to fill the world, but to give it back its space. The hill that remembers. The next morning, Dunrealta woke with a different softness around its edges. It was not the sort of difference that could be measured with stick or scale. The clouds still crossed over the sea. The chimney still trailed blue smoke. The hens still scratched stubbornly beside the fences. And yet something in the breathing of the village had changed. Doors opened without slamming. Voices in the street were not borne so tight. Even the sound of buckets at the well seemed less hurried. Eowyn felt it before he got out of bed. His head, which for so many weeks had woken full of loose threads, was clear. Not empty, not light with forgetfulness. Clear. He remembered the day's tasks, the price of oats, the patch he needed to sew onto his coat sleeve, the melody from the night before. But none of it shoved at him from within. Everything waited its turn. He sat up slowly and listened. On the other side of the curtain came the sound of Muireann grinding dried herbs in a stone bowl. The rhythm of her hand was steady, almost musical. Outside, someone was whistling. That alone was sign enough. It had been a long time since anyone had whistled in the street at dawn. When he stepped into the yard to wash his face in cold water, the air smelled of salt, damp earth and peat smoke, but also of something finer, harder to name, like clean clothes, dried in the wind, like stone after it has stopped holding storm. Two neighbors passing by the fence greeted him with a new calm. "We slept right through," said one, still surprised by the sound of his own voice. "My little one didn't wake even once," added the woman beside him, adjusting her shawl. "That hasn't happened in months." Eowyn smiled and answered modestly because he felt that claiming too much for himself would break the delicacy of what had happened. "I'm glad to hear it." They went on, and he stood for a moment watching the early light stretch itself over the roofs. Not everything was healed. He knew that. It only took a closer look to see traces of weariness still lingering on some faces. But the inward fog of the village, the one that had seemed to settle on every thought, had lifted enough to let the day come in. Breed appeared before noon. She arrived with her usual basket and a muted green scarf loosely tied around her neck. She paused in the doorway without ceremony and raised a small linen pouch. "I brought you lemon balm leaves and a little hawthorn blossom for tea." The body has to learn too what the air has begun. Muireann welcomed her inside. The hearth burned low and steady. 3 cups soon found their way to the table, and for a while no one spoke more than necessary. Éowyn liked that about the older women of the village. They knew how to let important things settle before giving them names. At last, Brid looked at him over the rim of her cup. "You played well last night." Éowyn wrapped his hands around the warm clay. "I nearly spoiled it." "Nearly doesn't count," she said. "Every true gift comes with the risk of clumsiness. What matters is whether you know how to return." He lowered his eyes, thinking of the instant when eagerness had hardened his fingers. "I wanted to hold it for everyone." "And that was the mistake," Brid replied kindly. "It isn't held for others, it's offered. Then the air does its part, the village does its part. You alone are neither dam nor wall." Muireann nodded as if the truth of that were old and self-evident. Brid set her cup down and settled more comfortably on the bench. "The melody has woken. That doesn't mean it's complete. There is more in it. Layers. Some put the mind in order. Others soothe the heart when it grows rough. Others help places remember their own stillness. Not all of them should be played together, nor always." Éowyn lifted his head. "How do I learn the others?" Brid turned her gaze toward the small, misted window. "By listening to what each place needs. The well gave you one part, the square accepted another. But there is a place you have not yet heard." A brief current of anticipation went through him. "Where?" "The hollow hill on the north side. The grass-covered mound where the primroses bloom earlier than anywhere else." Muireann stopped moving her spoon. "No one goes up there at dusk anymore." "Exactly," said Brid. There was no fear in her voice, only respect. The northern mound was one of those presences in the landscape that the village avoided speaking about too loudly. Not out of noisy superstition, but from an old habit. It was a round hill, too regular to be entirely natural, with a line of half-buried stones along its eastern side and a hawthorn growing alone at the summit. Children went near it during the day to gather flowers or chase butterflies, but they seldom played there late. The elders preferred to lead livestock around it in a slight detour. No one had forbidden it. It was simply understood. "Why there?" asked Éowyn. Brid smiled faintly. "Because some places keep better than others the music that should not be lost, and because that hill has been restless." That last phrase hung in the room for a moment. "Restless," he repeated. "Not in a dark way. Don't imagine anything terrible. Only out of rhythm. Sometimes when a village spends too many months with its thoughts in disorder, old places begin to reflect it. Birds avoid a branch. Livestock grow reluctant. Sleep nearby turns light. Grass does not grow the same. That is how the world speaks." Muireann rose to place another piece of wood on the fire. "I've felt it too," she said, looking into the embers. "The wind changes suddenly when it passes there." Brid turned her eyes back to Éowyn. "Go tonight, but do not climb with the intention of uncovering anything. Climb humbly, play little, and if the air asks you for silence, give it silence." The afternoon passed in simple work. Éowyn helped mend a net on the pier, carried water, hauled a sack of barley to the house of an old neighbour, and while doing all of it, he kept inside himself a quiet attention. He did not rehearse the melody. He did not want to wear it thin before its time. From time to time, between one task and the next, he noticed small signs of change that confirmed the night before had not been a shared dream. The baker had started singing again while kneading. A child who usually cried over every frustration sat happily stacking stones in silence. Even the gulls around the harbour sounded less shrill, as if their calls had found cleaner air in which to open. When the sun began to sink, he slung the harp over his back and took the northern path. The light at that hour had the color of pale honey spilled over stone. The slopes turned gold in patches. Low walls cast long shadows. The sea behind him had become a sheet of grey-silver crossed by slow reflections. With every step, the village noise fell farther below, until it became a kind memory. The hollow hill appeared among broom and short grass, serene and rounded beneath the evening sky. Seen up close, it was even stranger in its perfect proportion. Not high, but complete, as though it had been placed there with some ancient purpose. The hawthorn at the top leaned slightly westward. At its base, faded ribbons were tied to a low branch, perhaps by someone praying for health, for a good birth, or for the safe return of a fisherman's son. The stones along the eastern side showed through under moss, and among them grew a line of pale flowers that did not quite belong to the season. Eowyn climbed slowly. He felt no fear, only a bodily courtesy, like the feeling that comes when entering another's house where silence is loved. At the summit, he set down the harp and stood beside the hawthorn. From there, he could see Dunrealta below, gathered between sea and hills, with its dark roofs, its well, its little square, the thread of the road and the early glow of lit windows. It looked fragile and sheltered at once. The wind came from two directions, one from the sea, cool and long, the other from inland, warmer, smelling of dry heather and sun-warmed soil. They met above the summit, and for a moment the air seemed to turn around the hawthorn without touching it. Eowyn sat down. He rested the harp against his shoulder, brushed one string. The note rose clear and was at once absorbed by something larger than simple sky. There was no visible echo, but there was an answer. The hawthorn let fall a single leaf, though it was not yet time to lose them. That leaf drifted down slowly and came to rest directly on the body of the harp. Eowyn drew a deep breath. He played a second note, then a third. They were not yet the melody of the square or of the well. They were older, barer, as if the hill did not want a song yet, but first wanted to hear whether the one who had come carried enough stillness in his hands. The sun touched the horizon, and just as the light softened and the first long shadow wrapped the mound, Eowyn perceived that beneath the grass, very far below, through layers of earth and time, something remembered. It was not a sound in the ordinary sense. There were no voices under the ground, no hidden instruments, no murmur from buried chambers. It was more like memory vibrating within matter, like a table holding for a moment the warmth of a cup long removed, like an empty room still carrying the cadence of a song that ended a moment before. The whole hill under grass and the soft skin of moss retained a form of ancient silence, and that silence, hearing the first notes, had awakened. Eowyn remained still for several seconds. The harp rested against his shoulder with familiar weight. The hawthorn leaf still lay upon the wooden body. Below, Dunrealta was beginning to light its windows. Small golden points appeared one by one. The sea gathered the day's last glow. Everything seemed suspended in a calm waiting. He played again. This time he did not seek the square's melody or the well's reply. He let the summit set the pace, one low note barely touched, then another higher like a light rising, then silence, a long silence, and within it the hill breathed. He knew it by the wind. Until then the currents had moved around the hawthorn with a contained caution, as if testing the disposition of the place. Now they began to move differently, not faster, more deeply. The air rose from the eastern side, passed beside the moss-covered stones, and circled the summit with a rounded, almost ceremonial slowness. The hawthorn branches sounded with a fine murmur, like fingers brushing linen. Eowyn continued. The music that emerged was not exactly new. It was the same melody born beside the well, but stripped of some domestic tenderness to reveal an older bone beneath it. It still held the quality of ordering. It still held rest. But on the mound, there appeared something else as well. A serene depth, the sense that calm was not only the absence of noise, but belonging, being in the right place, hearing the world from the place it properly occupies within oneself. The notes descended softly like water over smooth stone, and then he saw her. She did not arrive from anywhere visible. She was simply there, on the far side of the hawthorn, where dusk light had turned to blue and silver. The same woman from the well. Her mantle seemed woven from mist gathered over meadow. Her hair mingled with the color of evening. In her hand she held, this time not hazel but a rowan branch laden with tiny red berries that shone like little embers. She did not speak at first, she listened. That alone gave Eowyn courage. He kept playing until the phrase came naturally to a pause. Only then did he lift his gaze. "It's different here," he said quietly. She nodded. "Here the air remembers farther back." The woman stepped forward and laid a hand on the hawthorn trunk. Before the houses, before the boats, before even the names the village now uses, there was already song on this hill. Not a song of feast, not a song of mourning, a song of joining, to bring hearts into accord with the place, and the place into accord with the season. Eowyn watched the grass barely moving at his feet. Who sang it? The woman smiled with a softness that was almost melancholy. Those who knew how to listen to the turning of the year, those who kept watch over wells, fires, and the exact instant when the first star appears above the sea. Some were of your village, some were of mine. In those days things were not yet so separate. That did not surprise him as much as he might have expected. Since childhood he had grown up hearing that between hill and house, between mist and threshold, there were seams that did not always stay shut. Sometimes all it took was the right hour, a true melody, a sincere attention for the world to show the fabric of itself. Did the village's unrest reach here too? He asked. She lowered her eyes toward the mound. Every place that protects also shares. Dunrealta has been carrying scattered thoughts for months, broken sleep, repeated worries, restless striving, not from guilt, not from malice, only from accumulated weariness. The hill received them too, and when an old place receives too much inward noise, its silence grows clouded. The words rested simply and clearly between them. Eowyn remembered whole days when even the light on the walls had seemed tired. He remembered nights when every villager appeared to sleep with a closed fist inside the chest. Then he understood that the melody should not only ease minds and hearts, it also had to return clarity to the places where the village unknowingly laid down part of its burden. "How is that done?" he asked. "By playing here?" "Yes, but not only here. You must learn to hear where the air has grown thick and where it can still run free. Sometimes it will be a house, sometimes a path, sometimes a room where someone has spent too long watching over the sick. Sometimes the shore, where men mend their nets in silence. The melody does not belong to a setting, it belongs to listening." Eowyn laid his hand over the strings. "I feel as if I barely know it." "As it should be," she answered. "Deep music is not mastered, it is inhabited." Then she extended the rowan branch toward him. "Today you may take this." Eowyn accepted it carefully. The berries were cold, smooth, intensely alive. "What is it for?" "To remember protection without hardness. Rowan does not shut the world out. It only puts its thresholds in order." He was silent for a few moments. The sky was slowly darkening. The first star had already appeared above the sea. "I don't know how to name you," he said at last. The woman lifted her eyes. In them was the light of moonlit water. "There is no need for a name in order to give thanks." That made him smile. "Then, thank you." She inclined her head slightly as if accepting not homage, but proper courtesy. Then she turned her gaze toward the village. play again, this time for the hill and the houses together. Eowyn obeyed. What followed was the most serene music he had ever played in his life. Not more complex, not more brilliant. It would have been hard to explain to anyone who had not heard it. It was simple as the curve of a wave, the rocking of a cradle, the gesture of covering a sleeping child. And yet within that simplicity lived the whole hill, the hazel well, the square beneath the ash, the chimneys, the nets, the heather paths, the weariness of the village and its possible relief. Every note seemed to take something rough and return it to the place where it could rest without harming anything else. As he played, the wind descended the northern slope and continued toward the houses. Eowyn could not see it, but he felt it. The melody traveled with it, not as naked sound, but as disposition, as though the air were learning a kinder posture and carrying it with it to windows, thresholds, and corners where evening soup was simmering and where some people, without knowing why, were beginning to stop frowning. In a house near the harbour, an old man who had spent weeks waking an alarm leaned back for the first time without hearing inside himself the usual stampede of memory. In a kitchen by the mill road, a young mother stopped going over every winter fear in her mind and found she could smile at the steam rising from the broth. In the blacksmith's workshop, where the smell of hot metal still lingered, silence no longer weighed like a debt. It simply rested. The hill changed as well. Eowyn felt it when the melody reached its final pause. The air around the mound grew clear, almost transparent in its stillness. The hawthorn no longer creaked with the fine tension it had held when he arrived. The moss-covered stones seemed to settle more deeply into the earth, not as if sinking, but as if agreeing. Even the new darkness gathering there felt hospitable. He lowered his hands. The woman of hill and mist was gone. She had not vanished with any theatricality. Simply the moment that allowed her to be visible had ended. There remained the hawthorn, the rowan branch, the first night, and a broad peace spread over the grass. Eowyn stayed seated for a long while with no need to think. Below, Dunrealta shone with a new softness. It was not merely a cluster of houses, it was a small, weary, dignified living thing, finally beginning to rest. When he rose to go back, he felt that something in him too had been set in order. It was not pride, not even certainty. It was closer to vocation making room for itself. As if up to that moment he had lived beside a closed door without knowing it was there. And that night he had found it open, not toward greatness, but toward quiet service. He went down the slope beneath the first stars, and with every step the air around him carried a music that was no longer his alone, but the village's, learning note by note to think more slowly and to sleep beneath the wind finely tuned. The village learns to breathe again. In the days that followed, Dunrealta slowly began to resemble itself again, not suddenly. No one woke one morning and declared that the trouble was over. It was not that kind of story. Small villages know the weight of seasons too well to trust noisy miracles. But something truer and more lasting did happen. Life stopped moving forward with that constant vibration that had accompanied it for so long. Simple things regained their rhythm. Bread came out of the oven without invisible hurry clinging to the dough. Nets were mended without pointless arguments. Nights deepened. Dreams broke less often. Eowyn did not play the melody every hour, nor every day in the square. He learned quickly that it would have been a mistake to turn it into a mechanical habit. The ordering song, or whatever name one chose to give it, did not answer to the desire to repeat a pleasant effect. It needed listening, occasion, measure. Some afternoons it was enough to brush through 2 or 3 phrases at the edge of the harbour, letting the sea wind carry them among the boats. At other times he played it on the threshold of a house where someone was recovering from illness, so softly it barely seemed music at all, more like the settling of air around a bed and a tired breath. Some days he did not play at all. He simply walked with the harp on his back and listened to how places sounded. That learning made him more patient. It also made him more observant. He began to notice things that once had escaped him. How the air by the mill held a different tension on rainy days. How the narrowest lane kept the echo of raised voices for hours. How some kitchens smelled of rest, while others, though clean and warm, still kept the sharpness of unease in the beams. He judged none of it. He simply learned to hear it. Sometimes Breed would accompany him part of the way. They gathered herbs on the slopes or walked together along the low fields where the reeds grew, and she spoke of visible things as if they were the kind surface of others, less easy to name. Not every disorder in the air comes from sorrow, she told him one afternoon while sorting yarrow blossoms with light fingers. Sometimes it comes from too much activity without pause. Sometimes from words swallowed down. Sometimes from a house where the floor is swept often, but no one ever opens the window at dusk. Eowyn smiled. That sounds more like practical advice than mystery. The most useful mysteries usually do, Brid replied. Muireann, for her part, did not make grand remarks, but she watched. One night when Eowyn came back from the harbour after playing for 2 fishermen who had been sleeping badly for weeks, she was waiting for him by the fire with a folded blanket across her knees. You no longer play as if searching for something, she said. I don't? No, now you play as one making a place where something may come to rest. The words stayed with him for days because they were true. He had stopped chasing the melody as though it were some extraordinary discovery. He was beginning to understand it as a form of care. With the coming of the new moon, the village decided to hold a small communal supper in the square, not from any desire for a great celebration, but out of gratitude that winter seemed less heavy than they had feared. Every family brought something: round loaves, fresh cheese, smoked fish, yellow butter, sweet porridge with honey, roasted turnips, pale cider in clay jugs. Lanterns were lit under the ash tree. The children ran until they were tired, then turned drowsy on blankets. The adults talked with that ease that comes when there is no longer a constant hum behind every thought. Eowyn had no intention of playing much that night. It was enough for him to be there, to hear how the village had recovered its own human music. Brief laughter, unhurried conversation, the clink of spoons, the crack of bread being broken, the contented sigh of someone over a warm bowl. But after a while, when the thin moon began to rise above the roofs and the wind came down from the hills with an almost curious softness, Breed gave him a sign from across the well. It was not a command, only the slightest inclination of her head, as if to say, now would be good. Eowyn took the harp and sat beneath the ash. The whole square already knew how to listen differently. No one asked for a song. No one expected a performance. Silences simply began to fall where they were needed, one after another, until the communal murmur left a clear space in the middle. Then he played, not the full melody of the mound, not the first shape from the well, but something rounder, woven from all he had learned. The music fell over the supper and the night air like a wordless blessing. The lantern flames grew still. The cider reflected a gentler light. The old wood of the tables seemed to release the weariness of many winters, and the village, hearing it, did not grow solemn. It grew simple. That was perhaps its greatest virtue. The baker rested her cheek in her hand and smiled with her eyes closed. The blacksmith breathed so deeply his chest seemed to remember youth. A mother rocked her sleeping child in the natural rhythm of the melody. An old man, who had rarely spoken since his wife died, at last murmured an old anecdote, and those near him laughed softly, without bitterness. Even the gulls perched on the highest roofs kept a respectful distance from the square, as though they understood that tonight the wind had found a more delicate task than carrying cries out to sea. As Eowyn played, he felt that the village air no longer needed as much ordering and had become more willing to keep memory. And that changed the character of the music. It no longer had to untangle so much. It could instead affirm, recall, settle. It was like combing hair that is no longer matted, only long and alive. When he finished, the night grew so serene that for a moment everyone heard the sea at the same time. That far murmur reached the square with the clarity of a cradle song. No one broke the silence immediately. Then voices returned naturally, but with a warmth that felt new. It was as though the melody had left an invisible lamp lit in the middle of every thought. Later, when almost everyone had gone home and only a few neighbors remained to gather bowls and extinguish lanterns, Eowyn walked to the edge of the square and looked toward the northern hill. Under the slim moon, the outline of the hawthorn was barely visible, and there, very high, where the shadow of the mound met the sky, he thought he saw again a faint glimmer, a figure more suggested than seen, still as an old blessing. He did not try to hold it. By then he had learned that true things cannot be grasped. A few more weeks passed. The village recovered habits that seemed small but were in truth deep signs of health. Women sang again while sewing in doorways when weather allowed. Children invented new games beside the well. The blacksmith whistled often, not always in tune, but happily. The baker once again forgot loaves in the oven only because she was busy telling stories, not because her mind had tied itself in knots. And when heavy days came, because they always come, there was now one important difference. Dunrealta knew how to recognize them before they covered everything. Windows were opened, people spoke more slowly, fires were lit calmly, spaces of silence were left between one task and another. Without needing to name it too much, the village had learned that the air also needs care. Eowyn went on tuning the wind, not as a proclaimed trade, not as a title, not as some fairground oddity, but as part of life itself. Sometimes he was called to play in a house where someone could not fall asleep. At other times he went to the cliff at dusk and offered a few phrases to the sea, so they might come back altered and clean. On certain dawns he climbed to the hazel well, only to give thanks. And now and then he visited the hollow hill, leaving a rowan twig or a strand of wool tied to the hawthorn as a sign of respect. He never again asked for the name of the woman of mist and water. Sometimes he saw her, sometimes he did not. There were occasions when a gust of wind had too conscious a shape, or when a stone at dusk seemed to hold its glow too long. That was enough for him. He had understood that some presences do not come to be defined, but to remind the heart that the world is wider and kinder than it appears on weary days. Then spring arrived. The first primroses opened on the northern hill like little pale lamps among the grass. The hazel well filled with green shoots. The sea lost some of its winter hardness. Ditches brightened with soft blue flowers. Lambs began to fill the fields with their charming awkwardness. And Dunrealta, beneath that quiet renewal, breathed with a lightness that was no longer forgetfulness of winter, but the fruit of having come through it better. One afternoon, in a kindly wind, Eowyn sat again on the cliff where everything had first begun to reveal itself. The harp lay across his lap. Below, the sea moved back and forth with immense patience. Behind him, the village sent its daily sounds into the air. A door, a laugh, a bucket, a dog, a half-remembered song. Over all of it, the wind ran clean. He played. The notes came without effort, as if the strings had been waiting for that season. The melody ordered the air around him, but this time he sensed something more. Not only calm, not only silence, he sensed gratitude, as if the wind itself, finding its proper course, were praising in its own invisible language the humility of well-tended things. A fire kept properly, a word spoken at the right time, a night deeply slept, a small community learning not to be overcome by inward noise. Eowyn let the music spread. The gulls wheeled slowly without breaking it. The grass along the cliff bent with elegance. The village below lay wrapped in a soft clarity, though the sun was already beginning to descend. And for a few instants, as brief as they were true, everything was in its place. The house and the hill, the well and the sea, the living and the memory of those no longer there, labor and rest, the mind and the wind. When the final note faded, nothing empty remained. What remained was home. Eowyn smiled without meaning to. He laid a hand on the warm wood of the harp. Before him, the horizon was turning pale gold and blue-grey. The wind passed once more through his hair, no longer restless or disordered, but tuned, spacious, benevolent. Like an old friend who, after wandering too long through lanes and thoughts, had finally found the right melody for coming home. And below in Dunrealta, while the chimneys began to draw threads of smoke across the evening and the doors opened to welcome the hour of supper, the air entered every house with a new gentleness, quieting one by one the noisy thoughts and leaving in their place a calm that was simple, deep and luminous, the calm of those who can at last close their eyes and rest beneath the invisible music of the world.